The wristwatch marked exactly 11:47 p.m. when Richard Montgomery stepped out of his armored Mercedes in front of the Waldorf Astoria, New York. The night air in Manhattan was heavy, laden with the characteristic humidity of the approaching summer. His steps echoed firmly through the lobby of the luxurious hotel as he adjusted his custom-made Italian tie, an automatic gesture for someone accustomed to being the center of attention in any environment he frequented. Waiting for him in the hotel restaurant, 3 Japanese executives anxiously awaited to close a $2 billion deal. It was just another ordinary night in the life of the man who ran the largest technology conglomerate in North America. At 45, Richard had built an empire that made the financial market tremble with each of his decisions. His austere face and penetrating gaze were known on the covers of the world's leading business magazines. "Gentlemen, forgive me for the delay." The deep, controlled voice sounded as he sat down at the table. The interpreter barely needed to translate. The respect was visible in the eyes of the Japanese businessman. The meeting proceeded like so many others. Numbers were discussed, contracts reviewed, promises made. Richard conducted everything with the precision of a maestro, each word calculated, each gesture studied. 2 hours later, with contracts signed and champagne glasses empty, Richard left the restaurant. He was exhausted but satisfied. The deal represented the consolidation of his company in the Asian market. As he walked through the lobby, his cell phone vibrated. It was Teresa, his assistant for over a decade. "Mr. Montgomery, you have an important commitment tomorrow at 8 a.m. with the board." "Cancel it." The response was automatic. "Reschedule for next week." "But sir, the shareholders..." "Teresa, in 15 years, have I ever made a wrong decision?" The silence on the other end of the line was the answer he expected. Richard hung up the phone and loosened his tie. For the first time in months, he felt the need to breathe air different from that circulating in the high-rise buildings where he spent his days. He dismissed his driver and decided to walk through Central Park. The night was surprisingly pleasant, and the lights from the surrounding buildings reflected in the dark water of the pond. That's when he saw her. In front of one of the more discreet bars on Fifth Avenue, a woman stood out. Not for her beauty, although she was undeniably beautiful, but for something in her posture that completely clashed with the environment. She wore a simple black dress that in no way resembled the expensive outfits of the women who frequented the area. Her brown hair was tied in a messy bun, and there was something in her eyes, a mixture of desperation and determination that Richard had never seen before. Their gazes met for an instant. It was enough for him to notice the dark circles barely disguised by subtle makeup. She quickly looked away, as if afraid of being discovered. Richard found himself stopping, watching her enter the bar. Something about that scene intrigued him deeply. Without thinking twice, he changed his direction and entered the establishment. The ambiance was simpler than it appeared from the facade. The woman was sitting at the bar, nervously fiddling with a glass of water. Richard approached, sitting down 2 seats away from her. "A whiskey, please," he ordered from the bartender, while observing the woman through the reflection of the mirrors decorating the wall behind the bar. She seemed even more tense up close, her fingers drumming restlessly on the counter. That's when her phone rang. The woman answered it with trembling hands, and Richard couldn't help overhearing the conversation. "Yes, doctor. I know the payment. Fear's late. Please, just a few more days. He needs to continue the treatment. I'll do anything." Her voice faltered on the last phrase, and Richard noticed a solitary tear run down her face, quickly wiped away with the back of her hand. She hung up the phone and took a deep breath, as if trying to regain her composure. It was at that moment that something inexplicable happened. Richard Montgomery, the man who had built his fortune based solely on rational and calculated decisions, felt an irresistible need to know that story. To understand what led a woman like that to be alone in a bar on a Tuesday night, clearly carrying a weight greater than she appeared able to bear. "Care for a drink?" The words left his mouth before he could think better of it. The woman looked at him, surprised and distrustful. Her eyes, a deep green, seemed to evaluate every inch of his face, as if looking for signs of threat. "No, thank you," she replied dryly, turning back to look at her glass of water. Pardon the intrusion, Richard continued, surprising himself. But I couldn't help noticing that you seem to need help. She laughed, a bitter laugh that didn't match her young face. You have no idea, she responded, standing up. But before she could take a step, her legs weakened. Richard moved quickly, supporting her before she fell. For a moment, they were too close. Close enough for him to smell the subtle perfume she wore, to notice the small freckles on her nose, to realize how much she was trembling. My name is Richard, he said, helping her sit down again. And I'd like to hear your story. She hesitated, biting her lower lip in a gesture of clear indecision. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she responded in a low voice. Laura, my name is Laura. If this story interests you, subscribe to the channel to receive all our exciting stories. Continuing, Laura stared at the untouched coffee cup in front of her, aware of Richard's intense gaze from across the table. The elegant cafe on the top floor of the Waldorf Astoria, with its breathtaking view of the sunrise over Central Park, seemed like a surreal setting for the conversation they were about to have. The early morning hours brought with them a gentle breeze that lightly rustled the linen napkins on the table. My son is only 6 years old, she began, her voice trembling slightly. Michael was born with a rare condition that affects his immune system. The doctors say there's treatment, but... She paused, taking a deep breath. The cost is astronomical, and the insurance refuses to cover it because it's an experimental procedure. Richard listened attentively, his fingers gently drumming on the marble table. There was something about her story that intrigued him deeply, something beyond the obvious tragedy of a mother fighting to save her child. How much? He asked simply. $200,000 a month, Laura responded, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. To someone like you, it must seem like little, but for me... She let the sentence die in the air. Richard frowned. And Michael's father? Doesn't he help? Laura's face visibly paled. He's not in the picture anymore. Actually, he never knew about Michael. It's complicated. There was something in the way she averted her gaze that lit an alert in Richard's sharp mind. Years of negotiating with the sharks of the financial market had made him an expert at detecting when someone was hiding information. You said Michael is 6, he commented casually, observing her reaction. It must have been difficult raising him alone from the start. Laura shifted in her chair, visibly uncomfortable. I was only 19 when he was born. I was alone in New York, had just left my parents' home in Ohio. It was a confusing time. Richard did some quick mental calculations. 6 years ago, 2019, something about that date reverberated in his memory, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what. And how have you managed to pay for the treatment so far? The silence that followed was heavy. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. I do what's necessary, she finally answered, her voice laden with a dignity that contrasted with the tears threatening to fall. I work at events at night, meet people who can pay well for company. Richard felt something contract in his chest. The way she said those words, as if each one physically hurt her, affected him in a way he hadn't expected. But it's not enough, she continued, now the words coming out in a continuous flow. The money I make barely covers the basic medications. The experimental treatment, it's the only real hope we have. Without it, her voice faltered. Why are you telling me all this? Richard asked softly, though he already knew the answer. Because you asked, she responded simply. And because there's something about you that tells me I can trust you, even if it's just to vent. At that moment, Laura's cell phone rang. She picked it up with trembling hands, and Richard could see the name hospital glowing on the screen. Excuse me, she murmured, quickly standing up. Richard watched her walk to the balcony, noticing how tense her shoulders were as she spoke on the phone. There was something about this woman that fascinated him. It wasn't just her beauty, although she was undeniably beautiful, but an inner strength that shone through even in her most vulnerable moments. When she returned, her face was even paler. The hospital, she said, her voice almost a whisper. They're threatening to stop the basic treatment if I don't pay at least part of the debt by tomorrow. She paused, taking a deep breath. I need to go. I have to find a way. Laura, Richard called as she was already getting up. Let me help. She froze, turning slowly to face him. You don't even know me. True, but something tells me there's more to this story than you're telling me, and for some reason I don't fully understand yet. I want to help. Laura studied him for a long moment, her green eyes shining with a mixture of hope and distrust. Why? Honestly, I don't know. Maybe it's fate. A sad smile appeared on her lips. I don't believe in fate, Mr. Montgomery. Life has taught me that nothing comes without a price. Then at least let me meet your son, he proposed, surprising himself with the suggestion. Afterwards, you can decide whether or not you want my help. Laura hesitated, biting her lower lip in a gesture that Richard was already beginning to recognize as a sign of her indecision. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded slightly. Visiting hours at the hospital are from 2 to 4 in the afternoon, she said, taking a napkin and writing down an address. If you really want to meet him. Richard took the napkin, his fingers lightly brushing against hers. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and he felt something inexplicable, as if he were on the brink of an important discovery, but couldn't yet see the complete picture. I'll be there, he promised. Mount Sinai Hospital was one of the most prestigious in New York City, with its imposing facade and modern facilities. Richard arrived punctually at 2 in the afternoon, bringing with him a package wrapped in colorful paper. He didn't know exactly why he had bought a gift. Perhaps it was the habit of always having everything planned, even in unusual situations like this. Laura was waiting for him in the lobby, wearing simple jeans and a white blouse, a completely different version of the woman he had met the night before. Her hair was loose, falling in natural waves over her shoulders, and without makeup, the freckles on her face were more evident. You really came, she said, a mixture of surprise and apprehension in her voice. I always keep my promises, Richard replied, following her through the white antiseptic corridors. On the way to the room, Laura updated him on Michael's condition. He's having a good day today. The fever has gone down and the doctors managed to adjust the medication. But, she hesitated, he doesn't know about our financial situation. For him, all of this is just a big adventure in the hospital. Richard nodded, admiring the strength of this woman who, even in the midst of so much despair, managed to protect her son's innocence. When they entered room 307, Richard felt his heart skip a beat. Michael was sitting on the bed, surrounded by colorful drawings that decorated the room's walls. His face was pale and a bit swollen due to the medications, but his eyes were an intense green, identical to his mother's. Michael, sweetheart, Laura called softly. This is Richard, a friend who came to visit you. The boy looked up from the book he was reading. Richard noticed it was an old edition of The Little Prince and smiled. It was a smile that lit up his entire face, completely transforming his fragile appearance. Hi, Michael greeted enthusiastically. Do you like stars? Richard blinked, surprised by the unexpected question. Stars? Yes, I'm reading about them, the boy explained, showing the book. Did you know there are billions of them and that some no longer exist, but we can still see their light? Something about the way the boy spoke, the way his eyes sparkled as he discussed. Astronomy provoked a strange sensation in Richard. It was like déjà vu, a distant memory trying to emerge. Actually, Richard replied, sitting in the chair next to the bed, when I was about your age, I was also fascinated by stars. I had a telescope and spent hours observing the sky. Michael's eyes widened with excitement. Really? Mom, did you hear that? He likes stars too. Laura observed the interaction with an intrigued expression, as if she had also noticed something familiar in the scene. Richard handed over the package he had brought. I brought something for you. I didn't know about your interest in astronomy, but I think you'll like it. Michael opened the gift enthusiastically, revealing a state-of-the-art tablet. Wow, he exclaimed, but it was Laura who seemed more impacted. Richard, that's, she began, but he gently interrupted her. It has an astronomy app installed, he explained, turning to Michael. You can point it at the sky and see all the constellations, planets, and stars in real time, and it also has a complete library on the subject. The boy's face lit up even more, if that was possible. "Can I see Andromeda? It's my favorite galaxy." "So of course," Richard replied, helping him navigate the app. As he explained the features, he couldn't help but notice some intriguing details. The way Michael tilted his head when concentrating, the shape of his eyebrows, the way he wrinkled, his nose when something confused him. All these small gestures seemed strangely familiar to him. The afternoon passed quickly between conversations about constellations, black holes and nebulae. Michael was impressively intelligent for his age, with knowledge that went far beyond what was expected for a 6-year-old child. At one point, a nurse came in to check the boy's vital signs. Richard took the opportunity to pull Laura aside to a corner of the room. "Why did you never look for his father?" he asked in a low voice. Laura's face lost all color. "It's complicated," she murmured, casting a nervous glance at Michael, who was engrossed with his new tablet. "Some doors are better left closed, even if it means depriving your son of a chance at survival." Laura stared at him, her green eyes shining with an intensity that caught him off guard. "There are things worse than financial problems, Mr. Montgomery. Trust me." Before Richard could insist on the subject, Michael called out to them, "Look, I found the Orion constellation. It was my grandpa's favorite." Laura froze. Richard noticed her reaction and frowned. "Your grandpa?" "Yes," Michael continued, oblivious to the sudden tension in the room. "Mom told me he loved stars too, but he went away before I was born." Richard noticed that Laura's hands were trembling slightly as she approached her son's bed. There was something there, some piece of the puzzle that he still couldn't fit together. "It's getting late," Laura said abruptly. "Michael needs to rest." Richard nodded, understanding the cue. He said goodbye to the boy, promising to return another day. As he was leaving the room, he heard Michael's voice. "Richard, thank you for keeping me company today. I hardly ever have visitors besides Mum." Those simple and sincere words hit Richard in a way he hadn't expected. There was something about that boy, something that went beyond coincidence of interests or the moving situation. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him back to that room, to that story that still had so many chapters to reveal. The presidential suite on the top floor of the Montgomery Tech building occupied the entire 80th floor, its glass walls offering a panoramic view of New York City. Richard stood, observing the city as the late afternoon light painted the sky in orange hues. On his desk, an open folder showed the preliminary results of the investigation he had requested about Laura and Michael. "Are you sure you want to continue with this?" Teresa, his assistant, asked while organizing more documents on the desk. "The board won't like knowing that you're personally involved with—" "The board doesn't need to know everything I do," Richard interrupted, turning to face her. "What else did you find out?" Teresa adjusted her glasses, a nervous habit Richard knew well. "That's what's strange, sir. It's as if Laura Thompson had simply appeared out of nowhere 6 years ago. Before that, there are practically no records of her. The birth certificate seems authentic, but there are inconsistencies in the school records. And about the boy's father." She paused. "There's no information at all." Richard frowned, picking up one of the photos on the desk. It was an image of Michael smiling at the camera of the tablet he had given him, taken 2 days ago during his second visit to the hospital. "And what about the DNA test I requested?" "The laboratory needs a sample from the boy for comparison," Teresa responded. "But, sir, do you really think that he might be my son?" Richard completed the sentence, his voice laden with contained emotion. "Look at him, Teresa. The same interests, the same gestures, even the smile. As your assistant for 15 years, I need to remind you that you've always been extremely careful in your relationships." Teresa chose her words cautiously. "And you never mentioned any encounter with this woman in the past." "Because I don't remember her," Richard admitted, running his hand through his graying hair in a gesture of frustration. "But there's something about this story, something I can't explain." The phone on the desk rang, interrupting the conversation. Teresa answered it, her face assuming a concerned expression. "Sir, it's Dr. Alexander Vance. He insists on speaking with you." Richard felt his body tense. Alexander Vance was the chairman of the board at Mount Sinai Hospital and one of his biggest rivals in business. "Montgomery," Alexander's deep voice sounded over the speakerphone, "I heard you've been making frequent visits to my hospital. I didn't know I needed your permission to visit patients, Vance." A dry laugh echoed through the line. "Don't be naive. We both know very well that your sudden interest in that woman and her son is no coincidence. I suggest you keep your distance. There are things at stake that you don't understand." "Is that a threat?" "A friendly advice. Laura Thompson is not who you think she is. And as for the boy, well, some truths are better left buried." The call ended before Richard could respond. He remained silent for a few moments, processing the conversation. "Teresa, I want everything you can find on Alexander Vance, especially any connection he has with Laura or the hospital in the last 6 years. Yes, sir, one more thing." She hesitated. "I received a call from the bank. Someone tried to access your personal accounts using old codes that only members of the Montgomery family knew." Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. Those codes hadn't been used in years since... "Impossible," he murmured. "Everyone who knew those codes is gone." The cell phone in his pocket vibrated. It was a message from Laura. "We need to talk. It's urgent. Michael had a crisis." Without thinking twice, Richard grabbed his jacket. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the day." "Sir," Teresa called out as he was already at the door, "be careful. The way Vance spoke, it seems there are more people interested in this story." Richard nodded, his mind already formulating theories. Why would Alexander Vance, one of the most powerful men in New York, be so interested in preventing his approach to Laura and Michael? And why would someone be using bank codes that belonged to a time he had tried so hard to forget? In the elevator, as he descended to the parking lot, Richard looked again at Michael's photo. The boy smiled with the same smile he saw every morning in the mirror, the same smile he had inherited from his father. And it was then that a distant memory began to emerge in his mind. A night in New York, 6 years ago, during the most turbulent period of his life when he almost lost everything. The elevator reached the ground floor and Richard stepped out determined. It didn't matter who was trying to stop him or why. He would uncover the truth, even if it meant facing the ghosts of his own past. The corridor of the pediatric ICU was silent when Richard arrived. Laura was waiting near the window that overlooked the room where Michael slept, connected to various monitors. Her face was marked by recent tears, and her hands kept twisting an already crumpled handkerchief. "What happened?" Richard asked, approaching cautiously. "He had a strong crisis this morning," Laura replied, her voice choked. "The fever spiked and his immune system. The doctors managed to stabilize him, but..." She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "That's not the only reason I asked you to come. Something is happening, Richard. Something that scares me." Richard felt his heart race. "Go on." "Earlier today, I received a visit in the room. A man who said he represented the hospital administration." Here Laura hesitated, looking nervously around before continuing. "He offered to settle all our debts with the hospital, said he could guarantee the experimental treatment for Michael, all paid for. The only condition was that I needed to leave New York immediately, go to a clinic abroad that they would choose." "And you didn't accept," Richard deduced. "How could I? There's something wrong with all this. Why now? Why after you appeared?" Laura turned to face him, her green eyes shining with a mixture of fear and determination. "And there's more. He knew things about me, Richard. Things that happened in New York before Michael was born. Things I never told anyone." Richard felt a chill run down his spine. "Laura, I need you to be completely honest with me now. What really happened in New York?" Laura closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering courage. "I worked as a receptionist at a luxury hotel downtown. It was there that..." Her voice faltered. "There was a party, an important event. Many businessmen, influential people. I shouldn't have been there, but one of the organizers invited me in just for a few minutes." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. A distant memory began to form. In his mind, fragments of a night he had tried hard to forget. "It was the celebration of the Montgomery-Vance merger closing," he murmured, the pieces starting to fit together. "The night everything changed." Laura stared at him, surprised. "You were there?" "Yes, but..." Much of that night is a blur in my memory. I had discovered an attempt to sabotage the contracts, something that could have destroyed my company. I drank too much. I was distraught. Richard stopped abruptly, a sudden realization hitting him. Laura, when exactly was Michael born? May 9th, 2019, she answered in a whisper, exactly 9 months after that party. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard leaned against the wall, feeling the weight of that revelation. Why did you never look for me? I tried, Laura responded, tears streaming down her face. The next day I went back to the hotel, but they told me you had left for abroad. I tried to contact your company, but no one took me seriously. And then, she swallowed hard, I started receiving threats. Messages saying I should disappear, that it was better for everyone if I just vanished. I was afraid, Richard. Very afraid. Alexander Vance, Richard murmured, the pieces falling into place. He knew. All this time he knew. Who is Alexander? Vance? The man who almost destroyed my company back then. The merger didn't happen because I discovered his attempt at fraud at the last moment. He lost millions and swore revenge. Richard ran his hand over his face, trying to organize his thoughts. And now he's the chairman of the board at this hospital. Laura, don't you see? He's using you and Michael to get to me. A sharp sound from Michael's monitor interrupted the conversation. Laura ran to the room, followed by 2 nurses. Richard watched through the glass as they checked the boy's vital signs. His son. Michael was his son. His cell phone vibrated. A message from Teresa. Sir, I found something. Michael's medical records were recently altered. Someone is trying to hide his true condition. Another message arrived immediately after, this time from an unknown number. Last chance, Montgomery. Step away from the case or everyone will find out what really happened that night in New York. Some truths are better kept secret. Richard looked again at the room, where Laura held Michael's hand, whispering words of comfort. There was no turning back now. The truth needed to come to light, no matter the cost. Teresa, he typed quickly, prepare the documents. I'm going to take custody of my son. The conference room at Mendez & Associates law firm was silent as Mr. Charles Mendez, the most respected family law attorney in New York City, analyzed the documents spread across the mahogany table. I understand your urgency, Mr. Montgomery, he finally said, but we need to proceed with caution. A petition for paternity recognition followed by shared custody is a delicate process, especially considering your public position. Richard, who was standing by the window, turned to face him. I don't care about the exposure. My son is sick and needs the best treatment possible. Every minute lost could be crucial. And the mother? Mr. Mendez asked, adjusting his glasses. Has she agreed to this? I haven't discussed the details with her yet, Richard admitted. But Laura is reasonable. She'll understand it's the best option for Michael. The lawyer frowned. Mr. Montgomery, with all due respect, you've only known this woman for 2 weeks. Have you considered the possibility that this might be a trap? Richard completed, a bitter smile on his lips. Doctor, if you saw Michael, if you talked to him, there's no doubt. That boy is my son. At that moment, the door to the room opened and Teresa rushed in, her usually composed face showing concern. Sir, we need to go. Now. What happened? Mount Sinai Hospital. I just received a call from Laura. They're trying to transfer Michael to another facility. Richard felt his blood run cold. Without authorization? Apparently there's an administrative order signed by Dr. Vance. They claim Michael's condition requires specialized equipment that only exists in a private clinic in Boston. Boston, Richard murmured, the gears in his mind turning rapidly. The same city where it all began. It's not a coincidence. Mr. Mendez stood up. Mr. Montgomery, if they try to remove the boy without the mother's consent, we can file for an immediate injunction, but we need the DNA test to strengthen our case. There's no time, Richard replied, already heading for the door. Teresa, activate our legal team. I want an injunction on my desk in an hour preventing any transfer, and call the press. The press? Teresa asked, surprised. Vance wants to play behind the scenes. Let's bring everything to light. I want to see him try to publicly explain why he's so interested in transferring a seriously ill child against the mother's wishes. On the way to the hospital, Richard received a message from Laura. "They're here. 3 doctors I've never seen before. They say the ambulance arrives in an hour." "Don't let anyone into the room," he replied quickly. "I'm on my way." His driver had barely parked in front of the hospital when Richard spotted Alexander Vance exiting the elevator in the lobby. Their gazes met, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. "Montgomery," Vance greeted him with a cold smile. "What a pleasant surprise." "Cancel the transfer, Alexander," Richard said bluntly, approaching. "You're not taking my son." "Your son?" Vance laughed, but his eyes remained serious. "As far as I know, Michael Thompson has no registered father, and as chairman of the board of this hospital, I have the authority to determine the best treatment for our patients." "And since when does the board chairman get personally involved in the transfer of a single patient?" "Maybe I'm just a man, concerned about the well-being of a sick child." Vance took a step forward, lowering his voice. "Or maybe I know things about that night in New York that you'd prefer to keep buried. Things that could destroy not just your reputation, but the entire empire you've built." Richard felt his body tense. "What are you talking about?" "Let's just say your memory of that night has some convenient gaps." Vance smiled again. "Do you really want to open this Pandora's box, Montgomery? Do you really want the world to know what happened after you discovered the alleged fraud in the contracts?" Before Richard could respond, he heard Laura's voice calling his name. She came running down the corridor, breathless. "Richard! Michael! He woke up and is asking for you. And there's something strange happening. I found this in his room." She held out a yellowed envelope. Richard opened it and his face paled at the contents. It was an old photo from over 30 years ago. In it, 2 young men smiled at the camera, himself and Alexander Vance. And between them, a woman he would recognize anywhere, his late wife, Helen. "Now you're starting to understand," Vance said softly. "Some family stories are better kept secret, don't you think?" Richard's private office on the top floor of his penthouse was immersed in the twilight's penumbra. Laura observed the old photo in her hands, her fingers gently tracing the contours of the young faces registered there. "Helen was my wife." Richard broke the silence, his voice laden with contained emotion. "She passed away 12 years ago, after a rare disease, the same one Michael has today." Laura raised her eyes, surprised. "The same condition?" "Yes. An immune system deficiency that affects only a few families. It's hereditary." Richard stood up, walking to the bar and pouring himself a drink. "Helen was the only daughter of one of the most influential men in the country at the time. Alexander and I were young executives, best friends, both in love with her." "And she chose you," Laura deduced. "It wasn't that simple." Richard took a sip of his drink. "Helen was promised to Alexander since adolescence, an arrangement between traditional families. But we fell in love and she decided to break the engagement. And Vance never forgave you. He lost everything back then. The arranged marriage was part of a larger agreement between the families. When Helen rejected him, her father also broke off the business alliances. The Vance family never fully recovered." Laura stood up, approaching the window. The city glittered below, oblivious to the dramas unfolding in the heights. "But what does this have to do with Michael? Why is he so interested in my son?" Richard hesitated, placing his glass on the table. "Teresa discovered something today. Michael's medical tests, they don't just show the disease. They show a specific mutation of the gene responsible for the condition, the same mutation Helen had." "What does that mean?" "It means Michael didn't inherit the disease directly from Helen. It would be impossible, since she passed years before. He was born, but he has exactly the same genetic variation. It's as if—" Richard paused, frowning, "as if there's a connection we're not seeing." At that moment, Richard's phone rang. It was Teresa. "Sir, I found something in the hospital's old archives. There was a genetic material preservation program initiated 15 years ago. Helen's name is on the list." Richard felt his heart race. "Go on." "The list is incomplete, but there are records that samples were preserved, and more. I found regular payments from the hospital to a fertility clinic in New York, all authorized by Alexander Vance. Laura put her hand to her mouth, understanding. The clinic, and it was near the hotel where I worked. Teresa, I need you to... Richard began, but was interrupted by another call. It was from the hospital. Mr. Montgomery, this is Dr. Cecilia from the pediatric ICU. Something happened with Michael. He had a reaction to the new medication, but there's something strange. The test results don't match his history. What do you mean? It's as if someone had deliberately altered the treatment protocols. Mr. Montgomery, your son may have been sabotaged. Richard hung up the phone, his face pale. Laura, we need to go to the hospital now. What happened, Michael? Vance doesn't just want to... Keep Michael away from us, Richard said, grabbing his keys. He wants to ensure no one discovers the truth about his origin. On the way to the hospital, Richard received another message from Teresa. Sir, there's more. I found records of a secret board meeting at the hospital 6 years ago. Alexander Vance presented a special project, a study on Helen's disease. He used her preserved genetic material for research. My God, Laura whispered, reading the message. Do you think that Vance used Helen's genetic material in some kind of experiment, and that somehow you were involved in this without knowing? Richard completed, his voice tense. That's exactly what I'm thinking. When they arrived at the hospital, they found Michael's room surrounded by security guards. Alexander Vance was there, talking to a group of doctors. Ah, Montgomery, he smiled upon seeing them. I was just explaining to the doctors about the urgent need to transfer Michael to a specialized center. After all, we can't risk losing another carrier of this very special condition, can we? The double meaning in his words was evident. Richard stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. You won't touch my son, Alexander. Not after what you did. Your son? Vance laughed. Or would it be more appropriate to say a Helen son? The silence that followed Vance's declaration was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the monitors in Michael's room. Laura looked from one man to the other, trying to process the magnitude of what she had just heard. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. What do you mean, Helen's son? Vance adjusted his expensive tie with a satisfied smile. Dear, didn't you ever wonder why you were chosen to work at that specific hotel in New York? Why you received that special invitation to the party? Nothing in your life for the past few years has been by chance. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched. What did you do, Alexander? What did I do? Vance laughed bitterly. I continued Helen's legacy, something that you, with all your fortune and power, never had the courage to do. When she left not just memories, but also the hope that her unique genetic condition could be studied, understood. You used her genetic material without authorization, Richard interrupted, his voice laden with contained fury. Authorization, Vance scoffed. I had every right. While you drowned yourself in your companies and acquisitions, I continued the research she so wanted. The genetic material preservation program was her dream, Richard. She wanted her condition to be studied, to help other people. Laura staggered, leaning against the wall. So, Michael, is the result of years of research and planning, Vance completed. A successful fertilization experiment using Helen's preserved genetic material. You, my dear, were carefully chosen for your genetic compatibility. Your hiring at the hotel, your chance encounter with Richard that night, everything was meticulously orchestrated. Richard felt his blood run cold. You manipulated us, used an innocent woman in your sick experiment. Experiment? Vance raised his eyebrows. I created life, continued Helen's genetic legacy. Michael is living proof that she lives on among us, and now with the advances in our studies, we can finally find a cure for the condition that took her away. That's why you want to transfer him, Laura murmured, understanding. Michael isn't a patient to you, he's a guinea pig. He's much more than that. He's the future of genetic medicine. Imagine the possibilities. Enough! Richard's voice thundered down the corridor. You manipulated lives, played God, all for her sick obsession. But it's over, Alexander. I'm going to expose everything. Vance smiled, a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Even if it means revealing your own unconscious participation in the experiment? That the great Richard Montgomery was manipulated like a puppet? That your encounter with Laura that night was nothing more than a meticulously elaborated plan? At that moment, Teresa appeared in the corridor, accompanied by two men in suits. "Mr. Montgomery," she called, her voice firm. "The representatives from the State Medical Board are here, and I also brought this." She held out a folder. "These are the original documents from the Genetic Preservation Program, signed by Helen, including a specific clause prohibiting any use of her genetic material without express authorization from you and her." The smile disappeared from Vance's face. "Impossible. I destroyed all the original documents." "Apparently, Helen was more cautious than you imagined," Richard replied, taking the folder. "She left copies in several places, including with her personal lawyer. Teresa just retrieved them." Laura, who had silently entered Michael's room during the discussion, returned to the corridor. "He's awake," she said softly, "and he wants to see you, Richard." Vance took a step towards the room, but was stopped by the medical board representatives. "Dr. Alexander Vance, we need you to come with us to provide clarifications about serious ethical violations in medical research." "You don't understand," he protested, his composure finally breaking. "Everything I did was for her. Helen deserved this legacy, deserved to have her condition studied, understood. Helen deserved respect," Richard cut him off, "and Michael deserves to live his life in peace, not as the object of your obsessive experiments." As Vance was escorted out of the hospital, Richard entered Michael's room. The boy was sitting up in bed, his pale face illuminated by a small smile. "I heard you talking," Michael said quietly. "So that's why I like stars so much? Because of her?" Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. "Yes, Michael." "Helen, you're—" She loved the night sky. She spent hours observing the constellations, dreaming of discoveries that could help other people. Laura approached the bed, holding her son's hand. "Michael, there's so much we need to tell you." "I know," the boy replied, surprising them both. "I always knew there was something different about me. But now—" He looked at Richard. "Now I have both of you, right?" Richard nodded, unable to speak. Through the room's window, the first stars began to appear in the New York sky, shining like silent witnesses to a truth that was finally coming to light: the boardroom of Mountie. Sinai Hospital was packed that morning. Board members, lawyers, and representatives from the Department of Health occupied chairs around the large oval table. Richard, seated at the head, maintained a serene expression as he listened to the preliminary report on the investigations. "The evidence is conclusive," declared Dr. Marianne Sanders, representative of the State Medical Board. "The experimental program conducted by Dr. Vance violated all established ethical protocols. But there's a positive aspect in all this. The research, though conducted unethically, produced significant advances in treating the genetic condition in question." Laura, seated next to Richard, squeezed his hand under the table. In the past weeks, since the revelations about Vance's experiment, they had grown even closer, united not only by concern for Michael, but also by a mutual understanding of what it meant to be pieces in a game larger than their own lives. "And what about Michael's treatment?" Laura asked, her voice firm. Dr. Sanders smiled gently. "The discoveries made during the research, now properly regulated and supervised, can be applied to his treatment. In fact, we're already seeing positive results with the new protocol." Richard nodded, thoughtful. After Vance's departure, he had temporarily assumed the chairmanship of the hospital board, determined to transform this place that had been the stage for so many manipulations into a center of excellence in genetic research, this time following all ethical principles. "There's one more thing," Teresa, who was standing near the window, intervened. "We found Helen's diary in Vance's personal archives. Apparently, she knew he would continue her research after her passing." Richard felt his heart tighten. "She knew." Teresa handed him a blue-covered notebook worn by time. "She left this for you, sir. I think now is the right time to read it." The meeting ended shortly after, with the assurance that all decisions about the future of the hospital and the research would be made with full transparency. When everyone left, Richard remained in the room, Helen's diary in his hands. Laura returned a few minutes later, bringing 2 cups of coffee. "Michael is excited about today's visit," she commented, sitting beside him. "The new medications are working." He had enough energy to plan an entire stargazing session in the hospital garden. Richard smiled, finally opening the diary. Helen's delicate handwriting filled the yellowed pages. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means the truth has finally come to light. I know Alexander will continue my research after I'm gone. His obsession with finding a cure for my condition is both his greatest quality and his greatest flaw. I can't approve of his methods, but I understand his motivation. What he never understood is that life isn't just about genes and experiments. It's made of choices, of love, of unpredictable moments that no science can control. My genetic condition may have determined the time I have in this life, but it doesn't determine the meaning I give to it. I left authorization for my genetic material to be preserved not to artificially create life, but so it could help better understand this condition that affects so many families. If one day this research gives rise to a new life, I hope that child is loved for who they are, not for the experiment they represent. Richard, you gave me the happiest years of my life. Now I ask that you use your strength and influence to ensure that my legacy is one of hope and healing, not manipulation and secrets. With eternal love, Helen." Laura wiped away a tear that ran down Richard's face. "She would be the first to celebrate Michael," she said softly. "Not because he's the result of an experiment, but for who he is, an incredible child who, like her, loves the stars and dreams of discoveries." "You're right," Richard replied, closing the diary. "And now we have the chance to do things the right way. The hospital will be transformed into a foundation dedicated to research and treatment of rare genetic diseases. Her name will no longer be associated with secret experiments, but with hope and healing." At that moment, a nurse appeared at the door. "Mr. Montgomery, Michael is asking for you. He said he discovered a new constellation and needs to show you urgently." Laura smiled, standing up. "Shall we? Our little astronomer awaits." Richard put Helen's diary in his briefcase and took Laura's hand. Together, they walked towards Michael's room, where the future Helen had dreamed of was finally beginning to unfold, not through controlled experiments, but through the unconditional love of a family that fate, in its intricate webs, had brought together. 6 months later, the garden of the new pediatric wing of the Helen Montgomery Foundation gleamed under the starry New York City sky. Dozens of telescopes had been strategically placed throughout the green space, and children undergoing treatment, along with their families, took turns observing the stars. At the center of it all, Michael, now with a healthy color in his face, and more energy than ever, enthusiastically explained to a group of patients about the different constellations visible that night. Laura watched the scene from a nearby bench, her heart overflowing with joy. The new treatment, developed from the now properly regulated research, had shown surprising results. Michael wasn't just responding well, he was thriving. "He has a natural gift for teaching," Richard commented, sitting next to her and handing her a cup of hot chocolate, just like Helen. "And you," Laura smiled, leaning back on his shoulder. "The determination is all yours." In the past few months, their lives had completely transformed. The hospital, now converted into a foundation, had become a world reference in the treatment of rare genetic diseases. Vance's unethical methods had been replaced by transparent and ethical research, bringing hope to families worldwide. "Dad! Mom!" Michael ran up to them, his eyes shining with excitement. "You need to see this. Jupiter looks incredible today, and you can see 3 of its moons." Richard stood up, following his son to the nearest telescope. Laura observed them, marveling at how life could be surprising in its paths. What had begun as a story of manipulation and secrets had transformed into something beautiful and true. "You know," Michael commented as he adjusted the telescope, "sometimes I think about Grandma Helen. Do you think she's proud of us?" Laura and Richard exchanged an emotional look. They had decided to tell Michael the full truth as soon as he was strong enough to understand. To their surprise, the boy had accepted his unique origin with wisdom beyond his years. "I'm sure she is, son," Richard replied, hugging him. "She dreamed of helping other people with the same condition, and that's exactly what we're doing now." Teresa approached the group carrying a folder. "Mr. Montgomery, the latest results are in. The new treatment has been approved for global use. We already have requests from hospitals on 5 continents. "And Alexander?" Laura asked softly. It was the first time she had mentioned his name in months. "He agreed to cooperate with the investigations," Teresa replied. "He's providing all the information about his research. The judge considered this in his sentence. He'll do supervised, volunteer work in genetic treatment clinics for the next few years." Richard nodded. After much reflection, he had decided not to seek severe punishment for his former friend. As Helen had written in her diary, Alexander's obsession was both his curse and his gift. Now, his knowledge would be used to help people, not manipulate them. "Look!" Michael suddenly exclaimed, pointing to the sky. A shooting star cut through the night, leaving a bright trail. "Make a wish!" Laura closed her eyes but realized she had nothing to wish for. Everything she had ever dreamed of, a healthy son, a true family, a greater purpose, one was there under that starry sky. "Did you know that shooting stars aren't really stars?" Michael began to explain to a group of children who approached. "They're meteors entering Earth's atmosphere and—" Richard embraced Laura from behind, both observing their son share his knowledge and enthusiasm. At the garden entrance, a new plaque shone under the soft lights. "Helen Montgomery Foundation, where science meets heart." "See that brightest star?" Michael pointed to the sky. "It's the first one to appear every night. I call it Helen." A gentle breeze blew through the garden, rustling the leaves of the trees. In the sky, Helen's star shone with special intensity, as if blessing this family that had found its way through the shadows to the light. "Michael," one of the children called, "tell us again that story about the little prince and his planets." The boy smiled, that smile that was both Helen's legacy and a mark of his own unique personality. "Sure, but this time I'll tell you a special version. It's about a prince who discovered that his true story was written in the stars." Laura and Richard sat down on the bench again, holding hands, listening to their son transform his own extraordinary story into a modern fairy tale. Above them, the New York City sky continued its eternal spectacle, a silent witness to how love, in all its forms, even the most unlikely and unexpected, had the power to heal, transform, and illuminate. The darkest paths,